morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment.
Good morning.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. All right, Tracy, are you and Ellen, are you ladies ready to go ahead and get started this morning?
Yes, we are. Are we ready? I'm ready.
Yes.
Yes, I'm still
Right.
going to keep trying to get online visually.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, Ellen.
Happy Friday, everybody. I have a colleague that every single meeting, she opens up with, get excited. So
Yeah.
I'm going to co-opt her every meeting opening and for this beautiful Friday morning and say, get excited, everybody. We're here to talk about anti-racism sustainability, and while that feels like a really heavy topic even for me, I'm excited about this. I'm excited about this journey that we've been on together, and I'm excited like we culminated our workshops with anti-racism, and then this morning we're going to be talking about how do we sustain that and how do we walk that out in practice. And so get excited. All right. So how many of y'all have heard, you can just do a raise your hand in the reactions or raise your hand here on screen, but be sure, feel free, not be sure, feel free to use the reaction button. But how many of you all have heard that Congress passed a law making Juneteenth a holiday? Yeah, right? Woo-hoo. And
Yes.
for those of you all who are in Illinois, how many of you heard that on Wednesday, Governor Pritzker signed legislation making Juneteenth a state holiday? And it has to be fully implemented by July 1 of 2023. So can we get finger snaps, hand claps, whatever, however you celebrate that to, it's a good thing. For those of you who may not fully understand what Juneteenth is, You know, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed into law back in 1865, freeing enslaved Black folks, right? But they didn't have Zoom and Google and internet and all of those things. And so that news didn't make it all the way across the country until 2 years later, when the cavalry showed up to Texas to say, hey, proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation, you have to free, as they were called then, and sometimes now, you have to free your slaves, but they were humans first. So they were enslaved people who were enslaved. They were not slaves. So Black folks have celebrated this, and it's picked up steam over the last several years, and become more prominent in the Black community. And now, as you see, it's culminated in a federal holiday now. So, you know, I'm excited about that. But I'm thinking of how to pose this question. What might be, it's not a reservation or anything negative about making that a holiday. I fully celebrate it. I welcome it. I'm happy to see it. But why might that cause me some cognitive dissonance? Why might I be like, huh? You did what? Think about the topic of our conversation today when we're talking about anti-racism sustainability. Think about how many of you all have heard, whether you fully know what critical race theory is or not, how many of you all have, and let me just say in a one sentence, 1 million foot level, very high level, critical race theory is the theory that says that systemic racism exists in the United States, and therefore, you know, there aren't neutral policies then, because policies all emanate out of our current systems. And so because racism is systemic in this country, we have to interrogate all of the policies and practices. So how many of you all, and that really was 1 million foot level, but how many of you all have heard about the criticism around teaching, talking about critical race theory? There are legislatures who have banned and are considering banning critical race theory. Yep, so I see people nodding their heads. How many of you all are familiar with, you're familiar with the debate around defunding the police? And it doesn't actually mean to take away all the funding. It's an unfortunate nomenclature, but it does mean to reduce funding and reallocate it to mental health services and more community health workers and whatnot who can work with marginalized communities and bring resources and help so that every time something happens, the police aren't the first responders into what really are community health issues. And so that's not being really successful. You know that there's been legislation and commissions for years and years, decades perhaps, studying reparations legislation for Black folks, but that has not gone anywhere. Everybody's aware of that. Are you aware of that? If not, that is a thing of Congress looking at reparations legislation, but it has been steadfastly refused and really hasn't gone anywhere. So those are just a few examples. How many of you are aware that Black folks are still being killed by the police, unarmed Black folks? All right, so with that conversation, why might I have some cognitive dissonance about the very great thing that happened with making Juneteenth a federal holiday, and now in my state at least, a state holiday?
Tracy, if I may, I could probably, at least what my thoughts are on this is, it's almost like it's checking the box, but there's all these other things still going on. And I mean, great, you gave people a day off. What does it mean? Great, you created a holiday, but that just means that now people are going to commercialize it. And what are they going to do with all that excess revenue in organizations? Probably nothing. Are they going to influence the Black community? Are they going to influence the brown community to make things better? Probably not. So, I mean, I have some very strong reservations between adding another federal holiday, although it is great that they want to commemorate that date. There's still a lot of work to be done. And I don't know, it's really checking the box so hard with their number 2 pencil that they broke the pen.
Matthew, if we were in person and not on Zoom, I promise you, I'd ask first, but I'd hug you.
I'd give you a hug too. I'd give you a hug too.
Oh my gosh. Ding, ding, ding. Matthew,
Yes.
it does nothing to address systemic racism. So it's not that every single thing that happens in this country, like you can't do anything. Don't create a holiday unless it dismantles systemic racism. That's not my point. My point though is that this is a way of trying to, as Matthew said, check the box hard, breaking the number 2 pencil and pacifying Black people so that you can say, what else do you want? We acknowledge it. Like, and most people, there occasionally I see some really ignorant comments, but I believe even the most, hardcore people who don't believe in critical race theory, don't believe that systemic racism exists. I believe in the most hardcore likely understand that the enslavement for 400 years, 300 years, plus Jim Crow and all of the other ways that this country kept Black folks shackled in many ways, and continue to. But that the hardcore 300 years of an enslavement of Black people, I believe that even the most hardcore would agree that that was a bad thing, right? And so, freeing, emancipating enslaved people, good, good thing. Now Black people are free and stop complaining. But Matthew hit the nail on the head, so to speak, to use that phrase. So we, though, are committing ourselves to being anti-racist practitioners. So what does that look like? And I don't know, Tratar, if you want to jump in, because when you and I were talking, you were talking about the work you're doing for recently released, formerly incarcerated folks, and how you're trying to look at the systemic issues in that.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Tracy. When we look at the impact of systemic racism, we find ourselves at the hands of the results of it, of those negative results. And so, yes, it does in fact impact those individuals who have been incarcerated, because when they enter or re-enter back into their communities, there's an added struggle to those struggles that are already present. And so imagine yourself being divided into a group and then being subdivided into another group, to where it just makes those challenges very much harder for you than the average person walking around in your community. And so each and every time that I serve a person who has been directly impacted by incarceration, I always advocate for them sitting at the table to be able to bypass those agencies that are going to negatively impact them. I don't send them to refer them to jobs or organizations or careers or opportunities for employment that would automatically disregard them to their background, because that creates you know, a negative impact within them as well. When you go to partake in services or you need some support or some help, the first thing that they do is have you fit a criteria according to whatever the criteria is for the program. And oftentimes that criteria does not include the formerly impacted. And so just to be able to do the work that would have those systems and policies that you spoke about that come out of the system, to have those address the needs of those formerly impacted is very imperative, you know, to us moving forward. And a lot of the, you know, just like you talk about the Jim Crow, a lot of those things that directly impact, negatively impact those who are formerly incarcerated, it comes out of a racist systemic system. I hope that answers your question as far as, you know, those formerly impacted. I really do have a passion for that because we, and I speak for myself when I say that because I am a person who was directly impacted as well. And it was hard for me to re-enter into Rockford in 2005 after spending 6.5 years in prison from the age of 18 to the age of 24 years old. Imagine a young woman coming home, having spent some of her prime years in prison and dealing with that kind of system, to only come home and have no support at all to re-enter into the community and be and have that kind of impact that you want. I laid in a cell for 6.5 years and dreamt of so many things that I can do. I made so many plans, but you quickly begin to see how reality will give you a reality check when you re-enter into your community and your passion and ambition to transform your life is not met with the equivalency of services and support when you come back into the community.
Yeah, we say that being convicted and doing time, you know, going to prison, you serve, you do your time and then you've served your debt to society, right? We've all heard that phrase, they've served their debt to society. It is a phrase, but it is not a practice, right? So when formerly incarcerated people come out, they are in many ways still incarcerated by a system that does not support the notion that you've served your debt to society and therefore we welcome you back. Okay, so good point. Thank you for sharing that, Tratar. I also want to acknowledge Paulina and Joanne and Andrea and Shiraz in the conversation around the double standard or the cognitive dissonance, you know, around creating Juneteenth as a federal and state holiday, but then not addressing anti-racism systems. So when we want to talk about anti-racism sustainability, I want to know the question for you all within your own personal practices about making a commitment to being an anti-racist practitioner in your personal lives, but also we're here and we're talking organizationally. How do you show up on Monday? Let's just say that, you know, today you graduate, you receive your anti-racism certificate, anti-racist practitioner certificate. We're celebrating. I told you to get excited. This is a graduation celebration. And now you're going to practice this new, put this certification, this newly earned certification into practice. what are you going to do? What are the first things that you start to do, right? Because again, I didn't start with our agreements that I normally start with, but remember the 4 agreements of courageous conversations about race. One of them is, we're not going to resolve everything today. Well, newsflash, on Monday, after the weekend of celebrating your graduation from with your anti-racist certification today, you're not going to go into your organization, show back up to work and resolve, be able to crown your organization an anti-racist organization. But think back to our workshop on anti-racism, what the brief conversation we've had this morning. How do you show up differently on Monday? What's your mindset? What are you thinking about? What questions are you going to ask? And I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot. This isn't a wrong answer or whatever, but we're going to talk about those this morning. We're going to get there. I'm going to help you. I'm going to provide you with a framework, but I want to just get a sense of where you are in your workplace, in your communities, the work that you're doing. One thing, one new way that you will show up as an anti-racist practitioner. You can put
Tracy, I'll chime in.
I see someone, thank you, Jackie, being willing to speak up more often when you see something. Thank you for that, Jackie. That's important. When you see it, say it. Yes. Somebody who just said they would say something?
Janessa.
Oh, okay. Hey, Janessa, thanks.
No problem. So for me, I personally want to start, or am starting, with the realization and the reality that racism exists within your own culture. And colorism is very prominent. I know, especially in the Black community and other communities as well, minorities as well.
Yeah.
And so for me, I want to start with the fact that we have it within our own cultures. And I have to remember that going in, because I think a lot of the time it's just always just a black and white thing, and it's totally not. Yeah. And so we'll fixate on that. Oh, well, it's just white versus black, and we often don't talk about the racisms within our own cultures. And so how can we even begin to go to another culture and we haven't even addressed the ones within our own? So for me, it's to start in that area within ourselves.
Thank you for that. And I think it's important. And those of you who have been with me, I can't tell you which workshop I said it in, but if you've been with us over this journey the last few months, then you've heard me say that you have to start with yourself, and that I am still, as a Black woman, deconstructing my own internalized oppression and internalized racism, right? I've said that before. Because I am socialized, Black folks are socialized in this country. Remember back to the cycle of socialization. We're socialized just like everybody else. And so we have and when we were enslaved, we were pitted against one another. So those who were in the big house, who got to work in the house out of the fields picking cotton, were treated better than and deemed better than those Black folks.
And you can say it, they were labeled. I know we don't want to say it because we don't like that word and how it was, but we know what it was, and we know how it was labeled.
Yes.
I'm not going to say the word either, but I mean that, at the end of the day, we got to start talking about it. And then that's what I kind of find that's laughable but sad about the whole Juneteenth holiday, is that when we have our children who are not going to be going to school on these days, and it's the teacher's job, because they're going to ask, well, why do we have that day off? According to the laws that are being passed, we're not even going to be able to talk about it. So what are they going to tell them? Oh, well, it's Juneteenth Day, you're just off. Yeah. We can't talk about it, otherwise we're at risk of losing our funding from the federal government.
Yeah. So that's the point. And so in the Black community, she mentioned colorism. There's a thing where, light skin, good hair, and good hair means that it more approximates the texture of white women's hair, is deemed good hair. And the tighter and coilier our hair is, it's deemed bad hair. even within the Black, I'm talking about in the Black community. I'm not talking about what white people put on us. I'm talking about what Janessa was talking about. So you do have to, this work is personal work, and you have to start with yourself. You've heard me say before, I co-opted it from somewhere. You can Google it and find out. I think there's a book on it, but I never read it or heard it. I heard it from a pastor. But you can't teach what you don't know, and you can't lead where you don't go. So you have to start personally, and that in the Black community, we've got work to do. But while we're doing that work, there's simultaneous work to be done. And so I'm looking at, I see Lisa saying, not shying away from bringing up race when it's a race point, instead of hiding race in the DEI conversation. And that is so impactful. That is so true. You've got to, that's why it's called a courageous conversation about race. Don't bury it in deep. Don't talk about diversity when you're talking about race. Don't talk about diversity when you're talking about how does this land with the people that we are served. And if the people you are serving are Black people, talk about Black people. If they're brown people, talk about brown people. If they're indigenous people, talk about indigenous people. Name it, because you can't address what you aren't even willing to name. So that is really important. Thank you for someone saying listening more, Peace Midi, listening more, empathize more, connect more, share stories, helping people explore and learn more. That's in the chat. So I think it is very important. And how are we, Shiraz, thank you, how are we creating this sense of belonging for everyone, or what's getting in the way of creating a sense of belonging? And asking for people to think about this.
Hi,
I
Tracy.
love the idea of the belonging. Yes.
I'd like to jump in. Let me just turn off my other.
Diane, that you're trying to jump in?
Yes, I am, but you're going to hear echo for a quick moment. Okay, so thank you for this opportunity to speak, and I appreciate the work that you've put in and all the work that you all have been doing around anti-racism, and I'm glad to join in this circle. I'm going to start with your last question, but I do want to make a comment or two to something that was said earlier. So for me, how I'm going to start Monday is how I have been living each day, right? Is to be intentional in my approach to speaking about race when I see it, but also acknowledging how it shows up in me and what I am going to do differently than I have done in the past. So what does that mean? I love looking at structures. I love looking at systems. I love looking at policies. And so everywhere that I have a chance to look, it's okay to look at and say, this is how it's affecting me. And I think that we walk in a society where we just experience things and expect and believe them to be normal. And so being questioning and inquisitive is important to looking at how my life is affected as well as how I'm affecting others. I like the idea, I went to a workshop once, and the way that some of this has been described or has been encouraged is, how do we look at, for people of color, Black and otherwise, how does whiteness show up in me? Because it is the air that we breathe. And for white folks to acknowledge, they're not absent of race, it's a racial identity. And how does it show up for you? And being able to have those conversations without hostility is important. Now that we talk about courageous, but it's also like, how do we humanely and without hostility have these conversations? Yesterday, I attended a very interesting, rich service with Harvard continuing education program, and they talked about Juneteenth, and they went back to the history of it. And so when you all are asking the question about what's the sustainability, I'm challenging all of us to think about, what am I going to do differently? Even if it means we learn a new skill. Psychologist Kenneth Hardy talks about the task of the subjugated and the task of the privileged. And each of us in our multiple identities, we sometimes stand in the identity of privilege. It might be in class, it might be in education, it could be in gender, or we may not stand in that privilege and have a more subjugated or marginalized identity. We don't always have to own it, because somebody has named it, the social political strata has named it. The folks who are experiencing it are not the victims. It is not their charge to change it.
Thank you
It's
for that,
our
Diane. I
charge
want to,
to look at the individual systems. So I'm happy about Juneteenth in the sense that it acknowledges that there is systemic racism, as you all said. Here
well,
comes
it
the
acknowledges that we were freed from enslavement, Juneteenth.
what we do differently is up to us.
Yeah, that's
It's up
absolutely
to
right.
each and
Thank
every
you
one
for
of
that.
you. The
Thank you, Diane.
sustainability comes with, okay, we recognize all of those things. Now, what am I going to do differently? And
Thank
to recite all the things that are, like for us to keep, it's important to recite it, but asking that next question, what am I doing differently? How am I holding myself accountable? Because all of those things that you said may be true. And then we, just like when we elect officials, need to say, and how are you doing this? And how are we doing this? And
Thank
what's different? And I'm holding you accountable and pushing. So that's, I would task us to charge ourselves to go a little bit harder, to go past, I think Traci, you've talked about this, that learning edge, like go past that, and it's going to be uncomfortable.
Thank
Do
you.
a little learning, do a little research, and then move uncomfortable till it's comfortable, and then go to the next uncomfortable.
Thank you. And you said something, and I saw it in the chat. Thank you for that, Diane.
Oh, I'm sorry. One more thing. I'm sorry to talk so much. I want to say this in terms of Tratera. One of the things, like you all talk, and Traci, you said this, the debt to society, not just for returning citizens, for any of us that have experienced oppression in any significant way, is like not even significant. You experience oppression. The debt is owed to you. Because to get to that point, and Tratera, thanks for sharing your story, is at 18, what could you have possibly done for the things that are social determinants, right? In terms of as a dependent, you weren't you should not have been responsible for your income. You should not have been responsible for your housing. You should not have been responsible for making food available to your family, or anything folks might have done to make their families whole in the systems that was around them or that was influencing their lives, even if they didn't know that's what was happening.
Diane, I'm
Because
gonna
a lot of this becomes formalized.
because I want to get
And
other.
so there's a debt owed to them. So when you're already starting with the minus and you try to make things whole, you still wind up with a minus if the system is not whole. So
You're absolutely right. Thank you
I
for
just like
that.
us to think about a way of reframing that for folks that are returning or experiencing racial discrimination or gender discrimination. How are they not whole before they experience the additional trauma? And the additional trauma racially can come every day and then move forward. So it's a lot of work for us, but I think the folks on the screen that I see are hardy enough to do it if they're willing to be brave and courageous.
All right, I want to get other people
Thank you.
into the conversation, and thanks, Diane. I want to get other people into the conversation. I appreciate all of the comments that are in the chat in terms of finding other people in your workplaces who are willing to work together. Yes, this work is not singular work, particularly organizationally. You've got to find those folks who are, connected and willing to do this work. The naming of whiteness, thank you, Paulina, for that. Being able to not only name, that how something is impacting Black people, but to name a whiteness. And it is imperative in being an anti-racist practitioner that you can name whiteness and understand what that means, and understand that if I say, hey, whiteness is permeating here right now, that I'm not attacking you personally. I'm not saying that you are a bad person. Remember our evolution here. This is not good or bad binary. Remember Dr. Robin DiAngelo and white fragility? We're not talking about good and bad binary right now, okay? We are talking about systems and how systems operate, and how we as people, unwittingly sometimes, unknowingly, because things have all been normalized and it's just natural. We're socialized this way. So we're interrogating systems right now. So this framework that I'm going to send to Billy and Pam to email out to you, I did not create it, and I'm gonna talk about it, but I wanna give credit to the National Juvenile Justice Network. because it's a framework that I use in some of my trainings to help organizations kind of start to begin looking at their systems and deconstructing systems and having an anti-racist lens on the system, right? And this is not a workshop this morning, it's a conversation. So I'm going to be asking you all some questions, but I just want to tell you how the framework that they lay out is kind of trying to identify where your organization is. And they have 3 or 4 categories that they put organizations in. One is the all-white club. And these are nonprofits that, find themselves, without trying, you just look up and you find yourselves, you're in an all-white organization. And so there's no intentional exclusion of people of color. It's just, we haven't been tuned into these things always, and organizations, have just developed, right? And so because this work is intentional, you haven't unintentionally screened anybody out, but there probably hasn't been any intentionality in screening people in either. So again, not a commentary, no commentary or judgment on the people in the organizations. They're good people, but just haven't done any analysis of racism or power relations and haven't power dynamics. And there's just no accountability to people in communities of color. That's one organization. And then if you want to, if you look at it as scaffolding up, there's the affirmative action or token organization, where these organizations have set affirmative action goals and wanting to diversify their staff and the staff and the leadership, including the board, are work, acknowledging and encouraged to reduce and eliminate their own prejudice, and there's anti-bias training and workshops. You may even have 1 or 2 people of color in leadership, but it's still basically an all-white club. It just now includes some structural and means to try and bring more people of color in. You move then to the multicultural organization. We see this a lot in the for-profit sector, where they're actively recruiting, actively talking about belonging and inclusion, celebrating having diverse staff and celebrating having a diverse board, and making commitments to reducing bias in the organization. However, people of color, while they're welcoming them in, are still expected to assimilate and join the dominant culture. So inclusion in these multicultural organizations, inclusion means we welcome you into our ways of being and doing things. We welcome you into the dominant way of doing things. Now, if you can get in, get in where you can fit in, and if you can assimilate, we welcome you. We want you to feel comfortable. But we're not making any changes and thinking more critically about how do we broaden the definition of what our culture is to be more be more inclusive, right? And then you get to the anti-racist organization, which is what we want to start working towards, right? And these organizations now are analyzing the history and pervasiveness of racism and power in this country, the power dynamics of this country, and feel comfortable talking about and naming race and whiteness and are comfortable being uncomfortable and pushing themselves to be uncomfortable, and are partnering with people of color, right? And if you're an all-white organization and you're an anti-racist organization, then you are partnering them with communities of color and other organizations of color to move this work forward, right? And so now, getting to, and included in what I'll ask Billy and Pam to send out to you is going to be a sheet on there where you can just do your own reflection on where your organization is. Are you an all-white club? Are you an anti-racist organization? Are you multicultural organization? Where are you, okay? and you'll be able to see the definitions of those organizations. And then, but you've got to have this anti-racist lens, right? You have to sustain, it is a journey, a continuous journey. It is not a destination. And so you have to be asking yourself, you have to have an anti-racist lens on your work and your structures. And so in terms of developing your anti-racist practice or your practice and praxis, Praxis, right? Once you identify for yourself, where do you think your organization is? You've got to start asking questions. And these are, find people that you can unpack this within your organization. Who makes decisions in your organization? Is there a decision made, an actual decision to dismantle racism? Is there a shared analysis where people have taken the time to examine who has decision-making power and who does not? Does everybody know how the decisions are made? Who controls the money in your organization? Who develops the budget? Who's doing the fundraising? Does your organization advocate with funders to support the work of people of color? Why did her name just fly out of my head? I was just getting ready to mention her name. Formerly married to Jeff Bezos. Melanie. McKinsey. What's her last name? Whatever. We're talking about Jeff Bezos' ex-wife, and I hate to describe her that way because she's a whole person, right? Not just his ex-wife, but I'm trying to situate very quickly, make you know who I'm talking about. McKinsey. McKinsey's got $1 trillion, right? And she's made a conscious decision to give it all away. And McKinsey just dropped another $5 billion yesterday or this week, day before, on organizations of color who are doing work in marginalized communities, and specifically and particularly in Black communities, not solely, and also doing other work in other marginalized communities like the LGBTQIA community. All right, she dropped $5 billion yesterday. And so for those of you in nonprofits, you understand how philanthropy works. You've got 1 million pieces of paper to apply. You have to give blood. Then you have to keep filling out paperwork to justify how you spent down to every single penny by line item. Like, right, it's a lot of work and effort and administrivia and cost built into getting philanthropic dollars into your nonprofits, right? McKinsey sent out $5 billion this week with no strings attached. You didn't have to apply. You don't have to account to her how you're spending it. There are no reams of paperwork. She called you up and said, hey, this is McKinsey. How you doing, girl? Get excited. You've got $5 million and you get $5 million. Because she is trusting the leadership of organizations to do the work without all the craziness of sitting high and looking low, making people jump through hoops to get $1 into marginalized communities, right? It's radical. Thank you for those saying that you're going to return. I see Lisa saying returning to the boardroom table with less cynicism when the pontification starts. That's awesome. More compassionate to yourself? Absolutely. This work is hard. This work is hard. It is hard. It is hard. Sometimes it's very lonely. So thank you for that.
She's Mackenzie Scott.
Scott, thank you. That is her name.
Yeah.
For relieving me from naming her as Jeff Bezos' ex-wife. I'm sorry for that. I hate doing that to people, but I literally could not think of her name in this moment. So old age, brain fart. So thank you for that. Mackenzie
Google.
Scott. It is a yes, and Google. Thank you, Google. It is a model for anti-racism practice and anti-oppressive practices and anti-oppressive and equitable lens, an equitable way to do business. Identify who are the organizations doing the work in the communities that where the work needs to be done, and how do I dismantle barriers to assisting those? So whoever your organizations are, whoever your programs are intended to serve, whichever communities they're intended to serve, whatever your mission is for your organization, how do you do it in an anti-racist way? You're asking yourself continuously the questions. The organization has to be asking itself these questions. So I don't want to, I hate putting people on the spot, but I am going to ask Lisa, your name says Lisa First 5 SF Region 4. I don't know what that means, but you're talking, can you tell us more about and I'm sorry to put you on the spot, and you feel free to decline.
I'm not going to decline.
But I wanted you to share your comments in terms of how this idea of being compassionate with yourself and with others when triggers happen and when blunders and mistakes are made.
I serve on I work for a commission that makes a lot of funding decisions. And in the past years, you know, they have come out with a huge anti-racist statement. And whenever it comes up, one person is it, then they all have to make a comment, because that's the way the world works. And then everyone gets triggered sometimes, and then it comes up. This is what happened to me, and you know, sometimes as staff we roll our eyes, sometimes we're like, okay, but it also shifts as we know people are coming to this table because they're struggling like I'm struggling to do this better.
Yeah, thank you.
And that we just have to wade through it. And when they say, you know, why are we doing things the same way? And to say, yeah, we are. And pushing, as you say, we're one of the government agencies that make people jump through a lot of hoops to get where they need to get to.
Yeah. And
to be able to change the way that works, change the way people get money and receive money, we're not going to have the same friends, at least for a while. And it's just the way it is. It's like hard truths in a good way. But it does start with each of us, and myself included, being better and being able to do things differently, and getting some humble pie, little humility in the work.
Thank you.
So I appreciate very much the work that you've done. And
thank you so much for that. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Linda commented a little while ago about learning and sharing how white supremacist culture impacts all of us, and particularly white people, and alienates you from your history and the trauma and whatnot. So again, it's a journey. It's a journey. I want to share an example of something in my own workplace. You all know that I am Chief Equity Officer at the Illinois Math and Science Academy, and you know, we operate like a college, and we're not part of the K-12 ecosystem. So, you know, like in the university system, there are there's intercession, and different universities call it different things, but it's that few weeks between the winter holiday break and starting back up in January for spring semester. There are these 2 or 3 week courses you can take and get credit, and it's crammed into the 2 or 3 week. Well, we have that at our organization as well, and we didn't in the past year, obviously, because of COVID. We didn't do it this January, but in the past, these intercession, you know, there's a whole course catalog, and several of the intercessions, they could be trips out of the country. They're international trips. They always have a learning component, but international trips. And so, you know, IMSA is a state agency. We don't have money to pay for, you know, all the students who might want to go on an international trip. So families have to pay for this. But we have a range of economic levels within our family. So not all students are able to pay. And so we give scholarships, and you get, you know, either a 50% or a 25% scholarship, right? And so that we can help marginalized, economically disadvantaged, economically marginalized students be able to have the opportunity to go on these international trips too, and so that it's not just the wealthier students who can go. Great, right? It's a good thing. We're increasing the availability of these opportunities. Equity, right? To create equitable opportunities. So the problem is that 3 years after I'm there, 3 years into the job, I just happened to, in a conversation with a colleague that was overseeing this as part of his job, oversees this out of the chief academic officer's, the principal's office, where students apply for these scholarships, that, I don't know, a family had complained that, their child got this 50% scholarship, but our families are put into tiers so that we know where they are economically, because while there's no tuition at IMSA or room and board, it's all free. We do charge student fees, and they're on a sliding scale according to family income. So we know our tier 1 students have the lowest family income, and so they pay a tiny fraction of what everybody else pay, other people. And their tier 2 pay a little bit more, tier 3 pay more, and tier 4 pay the full freight of student fees. Okay, so these tier 1 students are getting 50%, who get 50, apply for the scholarship, fill out the paperwork, the parent signs everything, turns in their, I don't know why we make them turn in their financial statement when we already know they're in tier 1. What difference does it make if they make $12,000 a year or $22,000 a year? If they're in tier 1, they're in tier 1. But anyway, they got to fill out the paperwork because, we're state agency government, So none of them were going. They were getting awarded these 50% scholarships, but none of them were going. Why? Because they didn't have the other 50%. I didn't know that at first. I hadn't thought about it. It was like a scholarship program. Like, great, we give scholarships so that we're giving opportunity. But then I find out that none of them are going. And who do you think, not 100%, but who primarily are tier 1 students? Black and brown kids. So on its face, a practice, it's not a board policy, these scholarships, it's a program, right? A program and a practice. On its face, it seems neutral. It is neutral on its face, but it was having a very racist impact because it was disproportionately impacting Black and brown students and preventing them, and some white students. It's really disadvantaging all economically disadvantaged students. But overwhelmingly, that's Black and brown students. And so it was having an overwhelming disproportionate impact on Black and brown students, who therefore still weren't going on these trips. Long story short, we stopped that practice. Now, not without a whole lot of conversation and gnashing of teeth and rendering of blood. But now, tier 1 students do not have to apply for a scholarship. All you have to do is say, I want to go, and your parent now fills out one piece of paper, a waiver and authorization for you to go, period. And then you get funded for the trip, period. Then our 2-tier students can get a 50%, or it might be 60%, I can't remember the numbers, scholarship. Tier 3 might get a 30% scholarship, and tier 4 pay the full freight for the trips, for the international trips. Do you see how an anti-racist lens, a lens of anti-oppression? Now, I'm not patting myself on the back. I was there 3 years before that even entered into my psyche, right? And it didn't enter into my psyche. It was an accidental conversation. And I was like, none of them are going. And the parent complained. Why? The parent complained because they still couldn't go, a 50% scholarship. They didn't have, if it's a $3,000 trip and I give you $1,500, if you don't have another $1,500, guess what? Your kid can't go. So, but that's a lens, that's how you have to always be interrogating things and questioning and asking questions and looking at the data. Otherwise, we've normalized policies and practices and programs and don't understand, haven't taken a look gotten underneath to interrogate how they are in fact actually operating in practice. Okay, so I'm gonna stop. what are your questions about how this works in practice? Do you have any questions? Yes, Lisa, the data always tells a story if you want to know. If you want to learn more, then look at your data. Questions? Intentionality is essential. Yes, and I want to get as many questions in our remaining 6 or 7 minutes. So one question each, please. Harlan, go.
I've got a lot of ideas. We were talking about truth and reconciliation with regard to police. Decided to rename it Truth and Reconstructing Public Safety. A whole campaign to deal with that. But how do I get people to put that together? Because I can't do it by myself. Same way with the Chamber of Commerce and getting them to champion equity, inclusion, and diversity.
One thought I have about that, Harlan, is that, and you may be doing this, but you can't do this work alone unless you control the whole thing. So you've got to partner with organizations who are already doing this work. And rather than saying, here's my framework, let's adopt this, share it, but see how you can come in and contribute perhaps to what they're already doing and work within the frameworks of people who are already doing this work, particularly people of color and communities of color who are harmed most by the current ways in which this system, the current policing system and full justice system in this country operates. Thank you for that, Harlan. Somebody else. Questions? I see one. How do this in community with each other, as it's impossible to do it alone? Yeah, how do you do it in community with others? Is your organization, particularly if you're an all-white club, or I'm going back to the National Juvenile Justice Network's framework, if you're the all-white club or the the affirmative action or tokenism club, how are you partnering then if you have a mission to do X or your programming is to serve Y? Then you look for other organizations in communities of color, Black-led organizations. If it's LGBT, whoever the whatever the mission is, if you're trying to serve marginalized communities, whatever the marginalization is, economically disadvantaged, LGBTQIA, women, Black folks, whatever the marginalized community is, partner with those who are already doing the work. Because I'll tell you, one of the problems that we have is that, and if I go back to the system of philanthropy in this country, overwhelmingly, who's deciding, who's at the table making decisions where investment goes? White people. And being very particular about, and with lots of oversight and lots of, strings attached for organizations that are Black-led organizations leading this work, whatever your mission is, leading X work in Black communities, but don't have the infrastructure to be buried in administrivia. So those are the things that you have to start looking at, right? I can't even take your $1 million or your $50,000 because you're going to make me spend 30,000 of it. I don't have the infrastructure to be able to do the compliance work tied to this. Can you trust Black-led organizations? If you want to if we're talking about, if the topic is how to impact Black communities, can you trust Black leadership in those communities to do the work? Does it always have to be overseen by white people trying to tell Black people how to do work in our communities and hamstringing us with $1 billion worth of compliance efforts? Okay. Somebody else. Any other questions? Final thoughts then. We've got 2 minutes left. Final thoughts. Thank you, Linda. I appreciate those comments.
Traci, thanks for continuing the conversation with us. I had a question in chat, but I actually have to drop. Thankful I've got a Juneteenth celebration at work that I'm headed to.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'll if you send me your email and your question, Traci@traciellis.com, I will respond to you.
I appreciate it, but I think that the question really, I guess what I wanted to end with is thank you. Thank you for continuing these conversations. They're really impactful on me individually and on my organizations. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Final thoughts? Yep, I see his comment about letting biases. That's why we started with anti-bias and understanding how we all have them and are socialized. All right, we're at 10 o'clock. I want to thank you all so much. I know that there's never enough time for these conversations. It could have gone on for another hour or two, but very appreciative of you all's engagement with me this morning and over the course of the last, I think Adrian started in February and I've been with you since March. I appreciate the conversation, your engagement, the richness. I give out my email. My email is really, my inbox is really busy, but so please charge it to my head, not my heart if I'm not immediately responsive. But my email is Traci@traciellis.com. Thank you all so much. And
Yes, thank you. Have a wonderful morning.
thank you. Pam and Billy, do you have just a minute to stay on? Thank you. I'll hang out for just 1 second.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful weekend. And thank you, Traci. You truly are a rock star.
Thank you so much.